Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Counselors of Real Estate, it is a distinct privilege to welcome you to the unveiling of the 2021-22 Top 10 Issues Affecting Real Estate. Thank you for joining us. I'm Michel Couillard, CRE 2021 Global Chair of the Counselors of Real Estate and President and CEO of Buzac Real Estate and Equities in Montreal, Canada. The Counselors of Real Estate is a distinguished international group of accomplished leaders within the real estate landscape, solving the world's most complex real estate challenges. Experienced, innovative, and credentialed problem solvers, counselors practice in 20 countries and offer expertise in more than 50 real estate disciplines across all asset types and classes. Each has earned the prestigious CRE designation. Now in its 10th year, the Top 10 Issues Affecting Real Estate represents the very essence of the compelling thought leadership for which the Counselors of Real Estate is known. To learn more about the organization and its 1,000 credentialed professionals, please visit cre.org. Also, we'd like to offer you a complimentary subscription to our peer-reviewed professional journal, Real Estate Issues, by visiting cre.org/publications with an S. While attendees will be muted during the course of today's event, you're encouraged to utilize the Q&A feature should you wish to submit a question. Your participation is welcome, and we'll answer as many questions as time allows. While the pandemic revealed vulnerabilities, increased risk, and accelerated trends and changes already underway, it also presented opportunities for those willing to recognize them. These are the unifying themes you'll find on this year's Top 10 list. To begin the countdown, please welcome Deborah Cloutier, CRE, President and Founder of RE Tech Advisors in Falls Church, Virginia. Deb is also Chair of the Counselors External Affairs Committee that develops the annual Top 10 Issues. Welcome, Deb.
Thank you, Michelle. It's wonderful to be here today. So let's kick off our number 10 issue, the bifurcation of capital markets. While we may not be experiencing the steep drops on our roller coaster ride since March of last year, the ride is far from over. When we look back at the last 15 months, what becomes clear is how different the market-changing event of COVID-19 was compared to prior market corrections. The debt capital markets have seen significant volatility, particularly in the public markets like commercial mortgage-backed securities, mortgage REITs, and agencies such as Freddie and Fannie. Swings in risk premium spreads have been on a roller coaster ride of their own. The number of non-current loans reverting to current and viable loans on income-producing properties will be driven by performance and the impact of changes in e-commerce, travel, and office use and demand. Mortgage REITs took a significant hit early in the pandemic, with some recent recovery driven by restructuring credit lines and paying down credit facilities that experienced margin calls. Debt funds issuing short-term transitional bridge and mezzanine loans have experienced stress, much of which came from financing costs. The market continues to be flush with debt capital liquidity, despite property type and market uncertainty. Looking out to the remainder of 2021 and into 2022, performance will dictate the amount of distress and losses, and risk management should dictate markets, property types, leverage, loan structure, and pricing for mortgage debt. The next year should also tell us if commercial real estate debt was too rich and whether perceived risk underestimated where prices should have been. Private equity funds have raised significant capital to deploy over various real estate sectors, with over $370 billion in dry powder available as of May of this year. With public, institutional, and private equity capital providing the market with a view of valuation and pricing, we still have not had an active transaction market. While transaction volume is slowing recovery, it's still well below pre-COVID levels. Price discovery continues to be limited, and buyers and sellers are holding their ground on the bid versus ask for assets that are still viewed with uncertainty as owners look to the vaccine and timing for a return to normal. The market has not seen the volume of expected distressed sales, but there is plenty of capital ready to deploy. Next up, let's move to issue number 9, adaptive reuse 2.0. Adaptive reuse is not a new term or concept to the commercial real estate industry. It is an evolving property use, expanding beyond the rejuvenation of single property blight in urban areas to now a broader neighborhood application, extending well into the suburbs and secondary MSAs. Adaptive reuse 2.0, what we call the neighborhood approach, is pivoting to address the challenge of what to do with hundreds of defunct suburban malls and thousands of empty big box retail stores that are surrounded by highly desirable and affordable neighborhoods. The trend from the preservation and enhancement of single, mostly historic assets in the core of our urban areas to a broader neighborhood approach is going to be accelerated in the post-pandemic environment as housing affordability pressures and remote work models disrupt the pre-COVID experiential urban city model. Looking at the initial 2020 census data and annual U-Haul migration reports, we see that our population and workforce are more remote and moving inland and to suburbia to find affordability and a quality of life beyond the dense urban setting that was enabled out of necessity in response to the pandemic. The neighborhood approach involves a re-examination of our suburban communities to reposition them for transformation before the opportunity for change passes them over, or worse yet, creates blight that will later need to be addressed at a much higher cost, especially in an era where so many retail, small businesses, and hospitality properties are closed. Some communities are ahead of the curve for the change that lies ahead, change such as driverless vehicles and a transportation evolution away from car-concentric infrastructure that's more walkable, driverless, car-friendly, and utilizes less land for parking. The Councilors of Real Estate has identified adaptive reuse as a top 10 issue for the 2021-22 list, not just because of the number of projects completed and underway that now surpass even self-storage as a property type, with more than 50,000 properties, but because it holds the promise of reconnecting our communities from what the interstate highway system divided from the 1950s to the 80s. Also, because of preventing blight that developed in our dense urban cities from flowing to the suburbs and secondary MSAs, as well as restoring much needed green space to our neighborhoods and cities that can germinate and cause more interaction of diverse demographic groups, as well as promoting good ESG and diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Next up is the issue number 8, economic structural change. So how do we assess the real potential of the economy for sustainable growth? What numbers indicate a true trend and therefore can be used for business planning purposes, and which are merely adjustments from the extraordinarily low bottom of the second quarter of 2020? We ask ourselves which behavioral changes made during the pandemic will persist into the mid-decade and which will happily be set aside when things feel normal again. Honestly, no one knows, and that's the equivalent of an indicator light in the cockpit going out for budgeteers in Congress and for bankers and developers, as well as investors and other real estate professionals. At this point, it is safe to say that economic models are of limited use in providing numerical guidance, and as such, the price of risk should be high, and yet it is not. Real estate certainly knows how debilitated property demand is. According to CBRE, office net absorption in the first quarter of 2021 was negative nearly 35 million square feet, and vacancy rose even more steeply than in the worst year of the Great Recession. With more than 111 million square feet still in the construction pipeline, office owners are braced for more bad news later this year and into 2022. Retail real estate was hammered long before COVID-19 arrived, as the sector has been overstored throughout the 21st century, and was threatened by e-commerce even prior to the population being required to shelter in place in 2020. A May 2021 analysis by PricewaterhouseCoopers pegs US hotel occupancy at 61.8%, up from the 2020 and 2021 lows, but still well below any year from 2013 to 2019. So likewise, hotel revenues are expected to stay at pre-2015 levels into next year. Even though real estate investors may reasonably expect an uptick in demand in the coming year, the ability to anticipate when occupancy and rent will rise frustrates underwriting, and cap rates ranging on average from 5% for apartments to 6% for offices are keeping pricing rich compared with the risk inherent in that underwriting uncertainty. We're observing many investors increasing their focus on property management aimed at retaining tenants and defending cash flow, while selectively seeking value-add properties amenable to active asset management. The thinking is focus on what you can control during this period, where macro level uncertainty is the growing headwind at the policy level in terms of the structural problems in the economy. With that, Michelle, back to you.
Thank you, Deb. Moving up to number 7, political polarization. There seems to be nothing new about America's political polarization, and it is not our intent to pick sides in this divided polity. Doing so only exacerbates the division. We want, first of all, to reflect on the pragmatic change and damage that the division is inflicting on our society, our economy, and on real estate industry, which is our professional field. Political friction is holding back America's economic productivity. We are squandering resources as we try to address problems that arise from the partisan divide rather than problems confronting us as common issues. Pre-COVID, real estate was feeling the pinch. The National Association of Home Builders has stressed how the broken immigration system has limited the production of housing, delaying deliveries, and driving up prices. Building service workers are calling for an immigration approach facilitating immigrants' full participation in the economy as an immediate priority. Many forms of real estate, including hotels, restaurants, personal service retailing, and medical office, have high levels of immigrants workers in their occupancy profile. So it is that we consider the present tribalism of American politics as a top issue for real estate now and in the foreseeable future. It hinders our productivity and therefore the nation's economic strength. And the real estate industry well-being is a function of our economic growth. Partisanship has been distilled into a more extreme position within Washington by the unexpected vagaries, gerrymandering, and the tendency to stick to status quo. In fact, Congress is more divided in many issues than the American public in general. We acknowledge that there is justifiably a diverse range of political ideology in America, but there must also be a kind of Venn diagram in which political position can acknowledge an area of overlap, a common ground that is apparent when those outside the Beltway are questioned. Even though the red and blue map represents truly differing perspective in priorities, the nation is definitely less polarized than are its elected representatives. The economy and the real estate industry would be rather far healthier, as would American society, if the pattern of party line voting in the halls of Congress could be transcended in favor of something very traditional, the art of compromise. Number 6, housing supply and affordability. In this era of political polarization, there are 3 things we can most agree on vis-a-vis housing. There is a tremendous need for affordable housing, still unmet. There continues to be a sentiment of not in my backyard or NIMBY mentality, and there is an ongoing supply deficit of market rate housing. Decades of underinvestments and underbuilding have created a shortage of housing in America that is more critical than previously expected and will require a concerted, long-term nationwide commitment to overcome. According to the National Association of Realtors, the state of America's housing inventory is dire, with a chronic shortage of affordable and available homes needed to support the nation's population. A severe lack of new construction and prolonged underinvestments have led to an acute shortage of available housing to the detriment of the economy and certain segment of the public. The scale of underbuilding and existing demand-supply gap is enormous and will require a major national commitment to build more housing of all types. Growth in America's housing inventory has slowed significantly since the turn of the century, particularly over the past decade. This trend affects every region of the country, creating an underbuilding gap of 5.5 to 6.8 million housing units since 2001. The Council of Real Estate agrees the lawmakers must work to expand access to resources, remove barriers, and incentivize new development involving the private sectors. And while housing construction is an integral part of the national infrastructure strategy, we are seeing several legislative initiatives to defeat NIMBYism at the local and at the national levels, as well as an infusion of affordable housing financing. Taking together, the light at the end of the tunnel looks more like a bright sunshine of hope that we're finally moving towards the end of affordable housing discrimination than the headlight of an oncoming train. Number 5, infrastructure, new imperatives. The COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and heightened societal interest in social and economic fairness have redefined infrastructure imperative beyond the significant ongoing necessity for improved roads and highways, bridges and airports and ports and mass transit and other traditional infrastructure needs. The latest bipartisan draft proposal at Capitol Hill will allocate $110 billion in new spending to bridges and roads, $65 billion to expanding access to broadband, and $48.5 billion to public transit, among other priorities. Extended over an 8-year timeline, the plan would allocate a total of $1.2 trillion. While our infrastructure focus on this year's top 10 is on some new infrastructure imperative, the need for enhanced investment in all areas of infrastructure remains high. If we are going to maintain a strong economic competitive position. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives the U.S. infrastructure a score of C-, classifying it as poor and at risk, while the World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Report ranks the U.S. 13th in the world. The civil engineers also estimated the U.S. infrastructure funding gap in 2021 to be $2.6 trillion, up 24% from 2017. Not only is public safety at risk from failed water systems, roads, dams, and other shortfalls, but the McKinsey Global Institute estimated that fully closing the physical infrastructure gap could translate into 1.2% or 1.5 million more jobs across the economy. The US spends only 2.3% of its GDP in infrastructure, while European countries spend on average 5%, and China spends about 8%. Even as the pandemic eases, enhanced broadband access is necessary to provide substantial flexibility to respond not only to the increasingly virtual society, but more effectively to future pandemics, natural disasters, and other events. The increase in last-mile deliveries to home and businesses has also required the creation of massive delivery systems, change inventory storage, and distribution requirements, and put significant demand on information systems. Automation, supply chain strategy, logistics, and transparency are seen as vital infrastructure areas in which to invest. As electrification and renewables increase, significant new infrastructure investment is needed in the electric grid. Additionally, buildings will consume about 40% of total energy use, and water systems which can represent 30 to 40% of your municipality's energy bill, need to be made more energy efficient. Cities and neighborhoods that work to encourage electromobility will be prime investment locations as tenants and their employees move to electric mode of transit. Cities and neighborhoods that adopt electric buses, rail, and other forms of mass transits will be cleaner, quieter, and less polluted. Buildings located charging hubs or that provide charging opportunities will be rewarded. And real estate owners who get out in front of these changes will reduce their cost of adaptation and will profit handsomely. To you, Deb.
Thanks, Michelle. That's actually the perfect segue to our number 4 issue, logistics. The counselors have identified logistics as a top 10 issue because it is at the epicenter of what makes our economy function. Whether it's a port, a rail line, a pipeline, such as the now very infamous Colonial Gas Pipeline, manufacturing facility, warehouse, farm, or even grocery store, all of these real estate assets are a critical segment in the supply chain funnel that is logistics. How logistics is functioning impacts the utilization of commercial real estate, right? Redundancy and the ability to process disruption are 2 key elements required to support the fast-moving and high-volume requirements of our modern-day logistics in the shop online and deliver it to me now era. Logistics post-COVID-19 will disrupt commercial real estate models, we believe, for many years to come. Disruption in commercial real estate capital allocations with more funding to industrial property and less to retail can be expected. There will be less dependency on physical stores and more on modern e-commerce warehouses that will be increasingly automated and less reliance on labor. And expect disruption in pricing as cap rates are going lower and lower for industrial properties. As the Monmouth, MREIC, and EQC REIT merger highlights, a 4 to 5% cap rate once reserved for those Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Inland Empire markets now is being applied to the Golden Triangle, encompassing portions of the Great Lakes, the Southwest, and the Southeast. Whether business to business commerce or business consumer real estate, it is totally in the field on which all of this is going to play out. Moving on to issue number 3, one of my favorites, ESG at the tipping point. Environmental, social, and governance initiatives really have indeed reached a tipping point. If you look at the 2019 McKinsey survey, 57% of CEO respondents said they believe ESG programs create long-term value, and 83% say they expect ESG to contribute more to shareholder value. In 2020, ESG funds more than doubled net new money intakes, capturing over $51 billion. The growth in recent years is fueled by multiple drivers, including consumer shifts, regulatory requirements, the trillions of dollars of wealth transferring to Generation Z and millennials, who are all committed to philanthropic living, and a blurring of the work and societal expectations, as well as a full-on sprint to attract and retain top talent. PwC's 24th annual Global CEO Survey showed that 30% of CEOs are concerned how climate change will threaten their organization's growth, and a growing aspect of the ESG puzzle for sure. Investors and market demand for ESG in real estate spans the globe, with the key questions being: what is material, where are we vulnerable, and which strategies will cost effectively mitigate risks? Transformative, enterprise-wide ESG initiatives in all sectors of real estate can be one of the best ways to reduce carbon emissions, accrete value, and demonstrate reputational value. The demand for progress towards ESG initiatives is encouraging capital markets and financiers to deploy an increasing diversity of financial products to support these goals. And at the same time, workforce development, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and recognition of the importance of health and wellness in commercial real estate are all setting new expectations for building operations and how to engage stakeholders in the communities in which real estate owners and users invest. So globally, we're seeing government stimulus funds exceeding $15 trillion and counting, even as early as May of this year, some of which is being directed to ESG programs. This further confirms that ESG has reached a tipping point, and now the expertise, the creativity, and the innovation that the real estate and finance industries are so well known for needs to be applied to assessing risk and deploying strategies to mitigate those risks, all while creating value for investors, occupants, and the capital markets in which we serve. Moving on to the number 2 issue, technology, acceleration, and innovation. Everything that's happened over the last 18 months really has been driving acceleration, but no more so than in technology. It once again makes our top 10 list, but under slightly different conditions and with more short-term implications this year. Constant themes like artificial intelligence, machine learning, the Internet of Things, and cybersecurity remain part of the landscape. They have moved from new to how do we do things now. This year, the news is not about new tech, but about our acceptance of it. Lockdown-driven changes in our work, in the economy, in our social structures, and even in our personal behaviors have pushed our reluctance aside. The acceleration and adoption of technology during the pandemic has impacted everything, and real estate is no exception. The question remains, what will stick? Real estate is long-lived and capital-intensive. Lasting impact requires the creation of value. Mere response to a pandemic-driven anomaly is insufficient to make permanent shifts. So value creation will be driven by 3 things: risk management, generating trust, and increasing utilization. The pandemic was a giant stress test to our industry, revealing vulnerabilities, appetites, and new and increased risks. We have been awakened to some familiar but nascent areas of importance, namely cybersecurity, supply chain logistics, and price instability. None of these are new concepts, but in a span of months, if not weeks in some cases, we saw high-profile hacks, shortages of resources like microchips, lumber, and labor, and rising prices across the board. I think the accelerated upgrade of connectivity, security, and hosted processes means utilization is being maximized and any place is now a potential workplace. This creates new pools of vacancy and pools of availability enabled by technology. Pandemic-driven uncertainty is fading as we are now off the diving board and well into the pool. When we stop panicking, decision drivers change from a survival-based question to those driven by optimization, by inflection points, and by moments where change can happen. Lease expirations, construction projects, mergers, and dispositions will all include an aspect of tech-based pandemic response. So it's time to get used to it. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Deb. Now, drum roll, number 1, remote work and mobility. COVID disruption significantly impacts human behavior in how and where space is used. Now, with the escalating return of business to somewhat normal and workers beginning to return to office. By the way, 32% on average return to office as of June 18th. This is a national average. Commercial properties, nevertheless, may need to be repositioned for changes in demand. One of the greatest lessons learned during the COVID is the benefit of more flexible, easily adaptable, and shareable spaces. It is clear that remote working and the acceleration of internet retail and the demand for larger and more natural spaces and other pre-pandemic era behavior will remain, at least at some level, which will impact land use and locales. We learn as the industry that flexibility and adaptability are paramount goals in real estate markets that desire resiliency when confronted with local and global disruption. As the recent rapid growth in virtual accessibility has made the world smaller, we will soon learn the resultant changes in the movement of people and the impact of the spaces they use. The immediate effect of returning to the office is the residual benefits of restaurants, coffee shops, pubs and bars, dry cleaners, and other retailers, and thus for their landlords as well. Further, after years of apparent and variance trend towards urbanization, the pandemic generally caused a movement away from urban cores, particularly for those with higher income who could afford to move, or for those lower income individuals seeking lower cost of living. Most of these relocation remained within the original region, 84% of it, and while some are returning, it is unknown as to the permanence of these movements or whether they represent a true urban exodus. Time will tell as to which population migration and space use behaviors will endure, as all real estate sectors will be watching closely and poised to react. Property owners and managers should be flexible in order to accommodate these demand-driven changes in the desired use and location of space. It is for these reasons that the Councilors of Real Estate believes remote work and mobility merits the #1 spot on the 21-22 top 10 issues affecting real estate. So here is the list again, starting number 10, bifurcation of capital markets. Number 9, adaptive reuse 2.0. Number 8, economic structural change. Number 7, political polarization. Number 6, housing supply and affordability. Number 5, infrastructure and new imperatives emerge. Number 4, supply chain logistics. Number 3, ESG at the tipping point. Number 2, technology acceleration and innovation. And number 1, remote work and mobility. And now we'll open the lines, I guess, the Q&A feature at the bottom for starting a dialogue or questions. Well, some were starting with this, but I actually received an email with a question. So that's not part of the Q&A, but I'll read the question. I guess it involves the capital markets, but will we see more non-performant loans and leading to distressed asset opportunities? That's basically the question. I don't know if you want to take that one, Deb, or I can say a few words on that.
I was going to say, why don't you start? I'll add in.
Well, in short term, the short-term evolution, the next few months, even start up to 2022, the evolution of e-commerce, I guess, and travels and office use and demand will dictate how many non-current loans will be stabilized or reverting back to viable loans, or depending how serious it is, then we might be facing, obviously, some distressed loan situation. It's all about the market response, how people and businesses will want to live, work, entertainment, and travel in the remainder of 21 into 22 and beyond. For 2021 and even 2022, performance will dictate, like as we saw earlier in the narratives, performance will dictate the amount of distress and losses, and risk assessment should dictate the markets, the property types, leverage, loan structure, and pricing for mortgage debt. So it's definitely something that we're going to be seeing more, and we should be seeing actually more distress sales as we go on, because now we're getting into the short-term leniency arrangement with lenders and servicers coming to an end, and renegotiating your loans is something that was actually quite common in 2020 and even beginning of 2021. Those arrangements are temporary and they're coming to an end. Also, the relief programs are coming to an end. Those relief programs that were in place to help tenants and pay the rent. So as the program run out and the temporary deferred and abatement agreements expires, we'll start seeing, we believe, more distressed asset situation, which will lead and will rise, thus avoiding more opportunity, thus allowing actually more opportunities. Deb?
I concur with what you said, and I would just say, you just need to look at the dry powder that exists in the marketplace today. There's a lot of opportunistic buyers waiting and looking for this distressed opportunities to take on, and we've seen actually and heard some information around folks looking favorably to hospitality, because the expectation is that with business travel returning, much of the hospitality downturn that it's in right now will come back. And so the question is, how long can people hold out, and then when will distressed debt become available? It looks like we have several other questions that have been coming in through the Q&A. I could maybe take one or two of them that look like they were talking about ESG issues. I will say that it has been interesting to see a number of the stories, the headlines in the news, not only about Exxon's recent, putting more voters onto the board and more special shareholder actions being called. There was also Shell, for the first time ever in the courts, assigning a responsibility to the company to reduce its emissions. I think you're going to see a lot more shareholder initiatives and actions being driven, and organizations are really paying attention to and trying to understand the impacts of their brand and to their control based on these new drivers. There is just an amazing intersection, unlike I've certainly seen in the last 30 years, related to expectations that companies are supposed to be solving societal issues, and climate change is definitely one of those. If you look at just the regulatory environment, both here in the US with the SEC and also in Europe with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, there are going to be increasing requirements put on public companies to have to identify, disclose, and continue to monitor the impacts of their business on the climate and climate change. Michelle, what would you like to take any of these other questions related to potential elimination of 1031 exchanges, the doubling of capital gains taxes, stepped up basis?
Yeah, there's a quick one here. When do you think the Fed will start raising the interest rates? 2021, 22, or beyond 2023? Actually, based on the Fed's declarations lately in the last review, they were not projecting any increase, at least for the rate, the base rate for the range for getting us to the end of 2022, even 2023. However, there's a situation that we monitor very closely, and definitely every investor, every developer, every person involved in the real estate industry is actually having a peak of the inflation right now. And inflation is creeping up slowly, but it is. Construction prices are way high. Energy is on the rise. This is probably going to lead a little bit of an inflation, at least for the balance of 2021. Hopefully, we're hoping that things will stabilize in 2022, and the Feds will be able to keep the rate stable the way it is. It remains to be seen. So inflation has to be looked at, we have to be aware of that. When it comes down time to raise the rates, obviously it has a lot to do with the state of the economy at that time as well. So they're very prudent as to allowing the recovery all the chances it needs to be able to be well underway. And there's a lot of still uncertainties right now in the market as we come back out of the pandemic. And the post-pandemic months to come will dictate quite a bit how things will recover and how fast the recovery will be. We'll also be influenced by the international markets as well. And everybody's facing a little bit the same situation, at least in Europe and Canada, and other parts of the world as well, in terms of inflation. So this is something to be aware of and to follow closely.
Maybe just to answer quickly one of the questions in the Q&A section, the Counselors of Real Estate does plan to continue to update with new information, statistics, and perspectives on the top 10 issues throughout the year. We will soon be launching longer, more in-depth pieces on each one of the top 10 issues in the Real Estate Issues publication of the counselors, as well as many upcoming presentations at industry conferences and in real estate groups. So each time that we're presenting these, we hope to be able to update them with the latest information and either further emphasize the points that we've made or make corrections based on new information available. So that was one of the questions that we had. And go for it.
Another question that I see here, will we continue to see manufacturing move back to the US to avoid tariffs and to ensure we have access to critical goods? I believe we will see more of that happening and continuing to happen. However, the supply chains in place globally are quite strong, and obviously, as you know, the production, the manufacturing in Asia and all the other parts of the world are back to work, are back in play. But there is an effort to encourage manufacturing back in the U.S., Canada the same, and I know it's the same in most countries in Europe. So I think we will see a bit of a trend that way, and a question of being more in control of our supplies. But there is definitely a tendency of having the supply chain very much in play globally, and that will remain. I don't think we're going to see a complete stop of manufacturing abroad and manufacturing everything in the U.S. I think more manufacturing will be involved anyway with the future development of many products. And again, it'll be a combination of manufacturing at home and manufacturing abroad. But we will see some manufacturing activity moving back to the U.S., definitely.
One of the other questions was, where do you see smarter commercial buildings fitting into all of this? I think the Internet of Things, the combination of new technologies that were forced to be used during the pandemic, like virtual showings and the ability to have more controls and sensors within buildings for remote monitoring. Buildings that had those technologies or abilities in place certainly were outperforming some of their peers in terms of ability to control costs, by controlling their systems remotely. And there is a lot of new technologies that we've been seeing going into buildings related to health and wellness, indoor air quality, measuring, testing, things of that nature. And then the other trend that we're seeing is really towards electrification of buildings, and a lot of new technologies being installed to make decisions about, say, if you have a solar array on the building, do you want to use that power now, store it through battery storage for future use, or sell it back into the grid based on price opportunity at the moment. So I'm definitely seeing a lot of new smart building integrations occurring, and that's really going to help, I think, drive the ability to control costs, to better be able to demonstrate the health and wellness of the buildings, right, for the occupants and the visitors, and an ability to really just have control in place for things like visitor protocols. Conference room B is available on the 6th floor. You can now go and use that. That sort of ties into this hybrid work model where perhaps people are hot desking or doing more hotel officing and things of that nature. So I just think and if you look at the amount of money pouring into VCs and startups around new building technologies for metering and monitoring, it's pretty remarkable. So I think that speaks to the accelerated adoption of technology as the second trend and relates to several of the other trends that we talked about.
A couple of questions popped up again on inflation. So my answer was like before, seemed to be a lot of concern about inflation, and righteously. Inflation should be actually looked at carefully, and I believe we'll be seeing inflation rising on a very short-term basis for the balance of 2021. Will also be the case in the beginning of 2022. Hopefully, it'll start going down and not affect too much the decision on raising the rates. So that is what I see, and hopefully it'll happen. But there is definitely a concern there, and obviously we know what if we start raising the interest rates, the impact it'll have on our industry, and we need all the chance we need to be able to bounce back and recover. Definitely not a good time for that, and but definitely I think eventually rates will start climbing, but hopefully by that time the recovery will still and well be on its way, in most likely 2023. There was a question about the 1031, I believe, Deb. I'm sure I can find it, but the impact, I guess, on the potential elimination of the 1031 exchange and the doubling of the capital gain taxes. And again, our recovery is very important right now. Obviously, the economy, but real estate always lags the economy as in its recovery, and we need all the chances for real estate recovery to be well on its way after these year and a half, 2 years of disturbances, major disturbances in our industry. To talk about and have serious discussions about potential elimination of 1031 exchange right now and the doubling even of capital gain tax is certainly not welcome as far as I'm concerned. And hopefully this will, I'm not sure if that's going to go through. But definitely the impact would be devastating at this stage in the recovery. So that's my personal view on this, but hopefully we won't see this happening, at least on a short-term basis.
Michelle, we've had several questions come in related to the councilor's top 10 issues, and are these US-centric, or what type of input or perspectives did we gather related to a more global kind of take on this? And I'd like to just share as the chairman of the executive or the external affairs committee that put this together, we actually had quite a strong representation from our fellow CREs in other countries, particularly throughout Europe, and each of the issues that we considered and the way in which the write-ups are presented, when you'll be able to go online and read the short descriptions now and the more in-depth write-ups that will be coming in the future months in the real estate issues publication. But yes, particularly European perspectives were added to each of the different topics and the treatment of them. And we tried in particular, for example, the ESG one is one that I authored, and we made sure that each of the supporting arguments or the implications and the drivers, the trends that are going on in the marketplace were both applicable here in the US and abroad in Europe, and tried to really make sure that this had more of a global perspective than perhaps in years past, so even more so this year. So we're quite pleased that we were able to engage our fellow CREs throughout Europe in developing them this year. And hopefully you'll see that in the write-ups, and we welcome additional comments and feedback from folks to help us in calibrating these perspectives.
Good point, Deb. And maybe I would add the number one issue, remote work and mobility, was actually co-authored by an American CRE and a European CRE, actually the chair of the European chapter. So yes, they were very much involved, and good point to raise, Deb. There's a will there be a written report based on this session? Again, the narratives will be, as soon as they're published in the real estate issues publication, those full narratives will be available on the site of the councilors, cre.org. Right now, you can access the summary of every issues that are actually on the site now, available again at cre.org. So again, question on the 1031 exchange. Am I hearing anything about changes to the exchange? Not lately. I'm not sure, Deb, if you can add something, if you've heard something on your end, or what the status is.
The only updates I've been receiving really are through the Real Estate Roundtable and their advisory committee. And I know that there is a great deal of emphasis within the real estate industry to try and, provide assistance or incentives or continue to support those things that aid the recovery of the real estate industry, along with things like the 149D tax incentive for energy efficiency improvements. There's quite a few bills or legislation that is being drafted and being recommended, and so I would suggest that if in your day-to-day job or role in your companies you have the ability to help influence the outcomes of these, that is very helpful to talk about it. Although the councilors is not a lobbying organization, so that's not one of the fundamental activities of the councilors of real estate. So we rely on our colleagues in the industry and our day jobs to take those positions and help support them.
I have a comment, actually. It is interesting that COVID and healthcare, healthcare especially, did not make the top 10 issue. Do you think this is because of the timing of the survey? When was the survey completed? The survey happened between end of January, beginning of February to almost end of May. I think the whole process, Deb, if I'm right there. So that's the timing. But to get back to you on this, on the healthcare, we're covering it a little bit in the infrastructure situation, with the especially with the impact of the COVID on infrastructure needs. And we're touching it a little bit here, but it could have been definitely an issue by itself. And obviously going through what we've been going through for the last 2 years or last year and a half, definitely the pandemic and healthcare especially is in the forefront. But we're definitely covering it with the infrastructure and the new imperatives being one of our healthcare systems, being one of the imperatives, and that is emerging from the infrastructure issue. There were 3 issues, by the way, that are front center from the impact of COVID. on infrastructure needs. There was the connectivity, the broadband access and connectivity. There was the supply chain, and it was the healthcare systems. And then there was also the impact of climate change to the infrastructure needs. And there we were dealing more with electrification and renewables, and the climate resilience and adaptation aspect of things.
Yeah, I would just add, Michelle, that as a reminder to our listeners today, so this isn't, the top 10 issues is not developed based purely on a survey of the counselors and their opinions. It's a very interactive, collaborative process of the members of the External Affairs Committee, where we gather input from our full counselors of real estate membership, but then also individuals that are experts in the different areas that emerge as potential top 10 issues. And believe me, there's a great deal of debate and banter, not only in what issues make the top 10 list, but also in the interconnectivity and the implications, which parts we want to highlight. I mean, any one of these issues could basically be a book or a, advanced master's graduate level course on the topics and what's occurring. And healthcare for sure, and obviously the COVID, right, has permeated all of these. It was our top issue last year, but we really tried to look at what are the risks, the emerging risks and implications over this year and into next year, as well as the opportunities that are rising out of them. So we didn't mean to exclude the importance of healthcare, but actually tried to treat it, as Michelle said, within several of the topic issues this year.
Another comment was to talk a little bit about the rising material prices increase and its impact on commercial real estate construction. We touched it a little bit in the inflation, and that's definitely an area where we're not only concerned with inflation, we're concerned by the rise of material price increasing. And that's definitely an issue right now, because one of the things that we're seeing, part of the flexibility and adaptation approach that landlords and real estate investors and owners are looking at is right now major capex expenditures, major capital expenditures in their assets to adapt their properties. I mean, just the adapt reuse of an asset is one thing, but even the upgrade and TI expenditures and what have you on your assets, obviously you're very much impacted right now with the rising material price increase going on. And hopefully we're definitely seeing it in the lumber, we're seeing in the metals, steel, we're seeing it in labor costs in general, and obviously energy costs. We've starting to see right now a bit of a comeback as far as the lumber pricing is concerned. I had a report last week on that, and we're seeing a bit of a stabilization, a little bit have been there, and also they're I guess foreseeing a little bit of a decrease in pricing in terms of the lumber costs, which is good, hopefully, because the rising of those prices were quite extended, and then we hopefully steel is going to follow as well, but by the look of things, we're still seeing steel actually on the rise quite a bit. So all this to say that we hope that things will stabilize in the next 6 months or so, and then we start going down in their price, and things will look better. But definitely, in my own experience right now, our increase in capital expenditures and in TI expenditures, tenant inducement expenditures, we're seeing an increase, almost 20% increase of what we saw just pre-COVID. So it is major right now.
Well, I think, Michelle, we are close to our time.
Are we? Yes, we are.
The time flies fast.
Okay. All right. So, well, I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you so much, Deb, and the External Affair Committee, the whole committee, for all the remarkable insights and thought leaderships in developing this year's Top 10 report. The narratives accompanying each issue may be found at cre.org/top10. On behalf of the Councilors of Real Estate, thank you for attending the unveiling of the 2021-22 Top 10 issues affecting real estate. Thank you again, Deb.